On our agenda, a statement by the Commission on anti-terrorism measures.
Is
that a point of order? What does that mean? Are you waving a white flag? Is it capitulation? Or catch the eye? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are not interested in taking part in this debate are encouraged to leave the room quietly in a spirit of collegiality, and that applies to all political groups. Thank you. On behalf of the Commission, Mr. Avramopoulos has the floor. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear President, honourable members of the Parliament, first allow me to express my thanks for giving me the chance to discuss with you today this issue. Just some minutes before I fly to Riga for the informal Justice and Home Affairs Council. I will actually have to leave at 5 o'clock, if you permit me, to catch my flight. And I would like to thank Vice President Katainen for taking the floor, if it is needed, on behalf of the Commission to conclude this debate. The brutal terrorist attacks in Paris were an attack against our fundamental rights. It has become once again clear that we are faced with an increased and severe terrorist threat to Europe. We have seen that terrorism knows no borders. Terrorist travel, financing, or access to weapons are by definition cross-border and require a strong, united and coherent response by the entire Union. This is not a time for competition amongst the institutions to act and to be seen as acting. Danger of announcing badly thought through ideas which cannot then be delivered, leaving citizens even more disillusioned with the European Union. Member States remain, as you know, primarily responsible for security. But Europe is part of the solution. There are a lot of relevant EU tools and measures already in place. The Commission is determined to take an approach that is comprehensive, result-oriented and realistically deliverable, with a focus on maximising the added value of existing EU measures and, where necessary, proposing new and complementary proposals. The Commission can add value by looking at gaps in effectiveness of existing operational law enforcement and cooperation tools. Security is essential for a functioning democratic society. It is a prerequisite for our citizens' well-being and prerequisite for citizens to exercise their own rights. Freedom and security are two sides of the same coin and not conflicting goals. Developing such a response requires that we all work together. This Parliament is our strategic partner in developing an effective response that will respect our fundamental rights and values and is in line with the expectations of the citizens of the European Union. This is why I am here to present and discuss our latest thinking and lines of action aiming at fighting against terrorism and radicalisation in context of the preparation of the European Agenda on Security announced in our work programme. All institutions will be examining further actions on counter-terrorism in the context of the upcoming European Agenda on Security. A first discussion of this is expected to take place at the informal Justice and Home Affairs Council in Riga and in the meeting of the European Council on February 12. A new agenda for European security will be presented in the coming months, around May, for the years 2015-2020. This agenda should aim to ensure the highest level of protection of fundamental rights of our citizens and those residing, staying or visiting the European Union. Upholding our democratic values and ensuring security are not only compatible, they are mutually reinforcing. It seems clear that there is a need to maximize the value of the existing instruments and deliver on pending proposals first before developing further measures. Furthermore, we must make sure that the measures in place allow us to effectively tackle the problems we face. To maximize the value of existing EU measures, we also need to make the best use of the Schengen Information System under the existing EU law for checks on travel documents and on persons at the external borders and assess any emerging need for improvement. The Commission is and will further assist Member States in identifying common risk criteria for checks on persons. Europol, in particular, will play an important role in the implementation of the future agenda. We need to make sure that it receives all necessary information from all Member States to deliver its added value in terms of intelligence and threat assessments. The same goes for Eurojust. Already in 2005 it was decided that the Member States should provide counter-terrorism information to both agencies. On cybersecurity and the protection of critical infrastructures, we need to reassess whether additional action is needed. The Boston Marathon bombing highlighted the vulnerability of public events. We will work to better protect such soft targets, but also critical infrastructures. A number of initiatives and trials are ongoing, which will feed into our reflection for future proposals. Delivering on pending proposals, and that is where I believe this House can add value to respond to calls from citizens. One example is the EU Passengers Name Record Directive. An EU PNR directive is necessary to enhance substantially the security of all people living in Europe. We need to make sure that our law enforcement authorities have access to data which is necessary for the prevention of terrorist acts and serious transnational crimes. No decision has been made except of the commitment of the Commission to work together with the co-legislators to achieve a legal instrument which is both effective and is fully in line with fundamental rights. I am looking forward to see and intend to help the European Parliament and the Council moving forward quickly on this file. I have read, we all have read, articles about what the position of the Commission would be. Let me be clear. The Commission did not come forward with a modified proposal or other initiative today. It was never planned. There has not even been a discussion in college since the orientation debate on the EU security agenda. Everything which is published allegedly reflecting a Commission official position or decision is therefore wrong. In terms of the data retention reform, and in particular the Law Enforcement Directive, I call on the co-legislators to work together towards a quick adoption. This will be essential in providing a clear and predictable framework for the processing of personal data in Member States and the exchange of such data between law enforcement authorities. Furthermore, we need to optimise the sharing of information between law enforcement authorities. To this end, the adoption of the Europol and Eurojust legal frameworks and the pending proposal to improve cross-border law enforcement training will be crucial. But progress can already be achieved without waiting for this. We will very shortly organise a joint meeting with Europol and Eurojust to see how information sharing can already be improved under the current legal framework. The Commission is seizing this moment of the preparatory work before the adoption of agenda to consider whether further measures are needed to address the evolving threat, including whether the existing EU legal framework needs reinforcement. We had our first discussion with my fellow commissioners just last week. It is clear that the fight against terrorism will be a major focus of this agenda. Let me now put forward some preliminary reflections on the objectives of the European Agenda on Security should address. How to continue to support comprehensively Member States in preventing and addressing radicalisation and other forms of extremism. The fight against arms trafficking is another building block. We need to review the implementation of the existing legislation and ensure greater exchange of information between Member States and with Europol, Eurojust and Interpol. At the same time, the fight against organised crime and terrorism financing needs to be stepped up. We must also deprive terrorists of their sources of finance. The link with organised crime is striking. Ensuring the effective implementation of the fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive and the Funds Transfers Regulation agreed upon in December is crucial. The existing tools to confiscate criminal assets must be used. We must ensure the speedy execution of all confiscation orders. How to carefully reassess the need for and the added value of possible EU solutions for data retention respecting the principles set out by the Court of Justice last year. The Commission is monitoring and evaluating the situation in each Member State before discussing the way ahead with the co-legislators. How to find sound solutions for the exchange of passengers' name record data with those third countries that are key to our security interests and to make sure that they are fully coherent with the solutions to be reached for EU PNR. Full implementation by Member States of existing legislative instruments on information exchange is therefore key. But I think that we need also to consider how to strengthen Europol's intelligence analysis capabilities on terrorism and radicalisation-related threats. We need to expand the use of existing EU policy cycle tools to address serious and organised crime-related threats, also for threats related to terrorism and radicalisation. On the external front, The EU is stepping up its assistance towards neighbouring countries and regions. The particular focus is on law enforcement cooperation, information exchange, extending criminal law tools and anti-radicalisation efforts. Honourable members of the Parliament, delivering rapidly and effectively on our response requires political will and setting clear priorities. The Commission has voiced its determination to take this up as a matter of priority. Working hand in hand with the European Parliament on developing a coherent response will be essential for defining and developing actions that keep Europe both secure and open. Thank you very much for your attention.
Onorevole Hohlmeier, la parola.
Mr. Hohlmeier has the floor. Mrs. Hohlmeier.
Commissioner, President, colleagues. The attacks in Paris and earlier attacks in Brussels, London, Madrid and other cities around the European Union represent major challenges for us. I would like to see the European Parliament stand firm with resolve in its approach to terrorism. We need to discuss the matter constantly in public. We need to show a sense of solidarity, regardless of whether governments are socialist, conservative, Green. All governments have adopted the same agenda on this matter, and I would like to see such firm resolve here in this Parliament so that it is crystal clear to the general public what we seek to achieve. We need to thrash out the points of substance, look at the instruments that law enforcement authorities need to fight against terrorism, PNR and so on and so forth. These are issues that may be controversial, but we need to look at these measures. We need to look at prevention, the different types of radicalisation. How can we de-radicalise people? What can we do in prisons? We need to talk to third countries. So my appeal to all colleagues is that we work together to prove that we are not going to be divided by petty issues.
Thank you, Ms. Hohlmeier. Mr. Pittella has the floor. Thank you, President. Today, once again, we cannot help but think of Paris. The city, the people so hard hit by the twofold crime that is so hard to forget. We think of Paris and we think of this mass murder, but also of the young Malian Muslim who protected the hostages at the Jewish supermarket and who gained French citizenship last week and has thereby become our fellow citizen. We want to underscore that kind of dignity. That should be the starting point, Ms. Hohlmeier. We will support tangible measures, but we're not going to support measures that undermine the freedom which is such a great achievement of the European Union. The European Union is founded upon freedom. But with that reserve, you can expect our full solidarity in all the necessary measures to fight terrorism. As the Commissioner has reminded us, Europe already has a number of instruments available to it. Let's make full use of them. We don't need to strengthen Schengen and the information exchange system and strengthening the external borders. We can do this without undermining the fundamental principle of free movement. Why do we need the PNR? There are risks here regarding the length of data retention and other conditions. Let's not try and fool our citizens. The PNR isn't going to give you a solution to problems on its own. The PNR may be one factor in a very long equation. Let's start by strengthening judicial cooperation. Intelligence pooling, strengthening our foreign policy, having a common policy in our dealings with countries on the southern shore of the Mediterranean. And lastly, our policy must embrace inclusion and integration. Many young terrorists come from pockets of poverty, from the margins of society, where people have been squeezed out. That's where we need to start. More education, more training, better funding for schools. We need more dialogue to fight fanaticism and terrorism, rather than trying to use this for political purposes. Let's take a serious approach to a serious problem. We can't have people saying immigration brings terrorism. In my country, not a single immigrant has been accused of terrorist offences. So let's square up to this together. We're ready to fight together and win the battle against terrorism.
Mr. Kirkhope, you have the floor.
President, Commissioner, the atrocities in Paris were shocking. As rapporteur of the EU PNR, it is clearly an important piece of the jigsaw in the EU's coordinated approach to fighting not only terrorism but serious crime. The EDPS, as stated, this Parliament does not have to wait for a new data retention directive or data protection package. I intend to apply the highest data protection standards and the judgment of the ECJ to my proposals. The EU counter-terrorism coordinator says the use of PNR data reduces ethnic profiling. Europol says there are over 3,000 EU foreign fighters, radicalised, military-trained, returning to the EU and exploiting the gaps and deficiencies in law enforcement information exchange across the EU. This directive would help to address that. Presently, there is no EU legal framework for citizens or the airlines, no clear legal or administrative redress in the use of data. My directive would provide these rights and clear legal boundaries. I ask the political groups and members, work with me, cooperate with me. We can find a solution together to protect lives and to protect civil liberties.
Mr. Verhofstadt, you have the floor.
Thank you. My message of this afternoon in this debate, Mr. President, is clear. We have indeed to work together in this Parliament, and I think that we cannot waste time, and that 2 weeks after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, we must make a leap forward, and we must conclude, I think, in the European Union on a broad and ambitious package to tackle terrorism, and that we have to do it as Parliament together with the Commission and together with the Council, because it's a common task and it's a common goal to reach. In fact, what we have to do, if you allow me, is to repeat what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, in 2001, at that time, besides other measures, we decided also on a package, and we created the European arrest warrant, which was at that time a dramatic change in Europe, because before, to have the extradition of a suspect, it took years. Sometimes to have somebody from the UK to bring him to France, it took 10 years to do it. While since we have the European arrest warrant, today, it takes days. Days to transfer somebody, a suspect of a criminal, from one country to another. And so I think that we need to have the same level of ambition now, not to do the same things because the threats have changed, but to have a same package to strengthen our security in Europe. And I think there are two things at our stake. First of all, a common capacity to analyze the information and the risk, because that is lacking in Europe. Because in all major terrorist attacks, Mr. Kirkhope, over the past 10 years, the perpetrators were known by the services of the different countries. And the problem is today not so much that we don't collect the info, the problem is that we don't share the info between our services in Europe. That's the main problem. And I know that, so what we have to do is to create what we call an Euro Intel, sharing information, common risk sharing, common analysis of the risks that are at stake. And I know I had already today a number of people say it's not possible. Article 4 of the treaty. Well, I can tell you, in the last period, we have changed twice the treaty. Once to have 18 members of parliament more, and a second time to change to have it possible to ESM, to save the banks. Well, if it is possible to change the treaty on a fast-track procedure to save the banks, it has to be possible to change the treaty to increase the security of the citizens of Europe here in this European Union. And secondly, we have not to make the error of the nationalist and the populist, that is to say, oh, the problem is Schengen. The problem is not Schengen. The problem is that we are not solidar between ourselves to strengthen the outside borders of the Schengen area instead of re-entering internal borders. And finally, on PNR, I want to say one thing, because Mr. Kirkhope has spoken of that. We are in favor of a European PNR system, but it has to go together, Mr. Kirkhope, with guarantees, with the protection of data and privacy. Well, because I think it's very clear that Mr. Pittella has right. It's safety and freedom at the same time. And finally, a last sentence, Mr. President, about the targets here in this debate. And it is, you cannot abuse the death of Charlie Hebdo like some are doing here in this Parliament. Mrs. Le Pen, Mr. Farage. It's not about a war between civilizations and religions. It's about a war against criminals and terrorists. And that makes the whole difference.
Onorevole Ernst, la parola.
Ms. Ernst has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I went home yesterday, I walked past a number of police cars and I don't know how many soldiers who were heavily armed as well. And I'm just wondering, are we creating more security and safety by doing that? Are we preventing the next attacks like those that happened in Paris by strengthening border controls or having 5-year data retention for PNR? Do you really believe that we're creating more security by doing that? No, it's a spectre that we're chasing. It's a fiction that we're chasing that's really not going to help us. We have to fight terrorism where it is generated. And it's being generated in countries like Iraq. Why? Because the Sunni population has been humiliated. There hasn't been any reconciliation. And terrorism is being promoted by Saudi Arabia. A king who the Western leaders are happy to shake his hand. The first issue has to be no arms exports to these sort of areas, ladies and gentlemen. And looking at Europe, terrorism is generated where there's a lack of inclusion, where inclusion is failing, and it's failing in every single member state. In Germany, for example, where people just stand and watch as young people go to the jihadis. You cannot fight fire with fire. It doesn't work. We need an honest debate on anti-Islamism, on anti-Semitism, on xenophobia, on marginalisation in our societies. Not more restrictions, that's not what we want. We need a genuine dialogue. We need to rethink society in the European Union so that the needs of the people flow into the role that we have to play here.
Onorevole Albrecht, la parola.
Mr. Albrecht has the floor.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Yes, we need to strengthen security. I agree with all those who say we need to deliver whatever is necessary and proportionate to get a higher level of security. But what you are proposing now, the proposal of blanket surveillance, of blanket mass surveillance of citizens, is exactly the opposite to that. It's not delivering that. Instead, you are delivering a symbolic measure on the cost of effective security and the civil liberties of EU citizens. Already before the Paris attacks, it was possible to know who is on which plane. We already know it. We have the advanced passenger information. It's there, we can access it, we know who's on the plane. So with regard to known suspects, we can follow them. So why don't we focus on the suspects? Why don't we focus on the risk? That is what you need to do in your directive, because that would be a focused approach on security. And we really need to strengthen those officers, police officers, security persons, locally, regionally and on the European level, to analyze this information. They need to be able to connect the dots. That's exactly what was missing in the past and what led us to this unsecure situation like today. But the problem is we spend all our money into blanket surveillance measures like data retention and other issues. It's hundreds of millions euros you want to invest in the retention of blanket retention of personal name records. This money is dearly needed in the police offices everywhere in Europe, and it's dearly needed for the coordination of European security and police authorities. Europol has just a few money to set up joint investigation teams. We need to invest the money there. That's what we need. So I'm not convinced, Mr. Avramopoulos. I'm not convinced from your proposals, and I'm not the only one, by the way. It's also the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice, which has said very clearly it's not legal, it's not in line with the fundamental right on data protection to just survey everybody. You have to choose where you're shooting. You have to choose where you're going after. You have to create some determinators to say there's a risk or there's a suspicion. Just don't survey everybody, because that would not be something different like China or Bahrain does. Thank you very much.
There is a point of order. Mr. Arnott, you have the floor.
Yes, I'd just like clarification, please, on why blue cards aren't being taken, because at the last Strasbourg session, of course, this was asked, and if we don't have the opportunity to question speakers, then what happens in this chamber is merely a series of pre-prepared statements. It's not debate. So if there is a reason for it, and it was supposed to go back to the Bureau, and but there's been no explanation whatsoever. So I'd like to know, please, is there a reason why we're not having a debate today, and could it be communicated to us if there is?
Onorevole Arnott.
Mr. Arnott, it's up to the President to decide whether or not to allow blue cards under the rules of procedure. Mr. Nuttall has the floor now.
Mr. President, Commissioner, as I speak, we are in a building which is guarded by the Belgian army in full combat dress. And that tells us all we need to know about the terror threat we face from extremist Islam. We already have witnessed attacks in London, Madrid, Brussels and now Paris. And let's be honest here, it's not a case of if there's another attack, it's a case of when and where. And we can prepare all we want, but none of this will be successful if we don't have the cooperation of the Muslim communities themselves. Europe's Muslims must do more to root out extremists that exist in their midst. They must take responsibility to cut out this cancer. May I suggest that they follow the lead of President Sisi of Egypt, who recently attended a Coptic mass and called on Islamic scholars to renounce jihad. We also must deal with the thorny issue of Turkey. It is the same Turkey which turns a blind eye to extremist Muslims hopping over the border to fight in Syria for ISIS. It is the same Turkey which idly stood by and did almost nothing whilst the border town of Kobani was under attack. It is the same Turkey which received nearly €1 billion from this place in pre-accession funding. And it is the same Turkey that all of the British political parties, except my own, want in the European Union. Therefore, if we want to tackle terrorism in Europe, firstly, we need Europe's Muslims on side. Secondly, we must hold Turkey to account. And thirdly, we must control our own borders. Thank you very much.
Onorevole Synadinos, la parola.
Mr. Synadinos has the floor.
Chair. Unfortunately, the recent events in Paris and Belgium, the everyday attacks of jihadi terrorists, armed robbery, kidnappings, rapes and murder, and the fact that well known by the security service European citizens who are extreme Islamists, the fact that they can move into and out of Europe shows that our policies are wrong. We have many laws, strategies and actions, but we cannot just discuss it. We must take courageous decisions. We must use all the mechanisms we have at a union level, and let's just stop being so stupid as to deal only with third countries, because in this way we bury our head in the sand and we cannot see what is staring us in the face. Terrorism is an asymmetric threat, and it should be thus faced. Our rapid reaction units, forces like Frontex and Europol, do not have the necessary operational equipment. They don't have the know-how, they don't have the equipment and the information. But this is indispensable. The messages we receive every day warn of new dangers. Our enemies know our weaknesses. We also must own up to them.
Madame Dati, vous avez la parole.
Ms. Dati has the floor. Thank you, President. Commissioner, events in Paris and Belgium and attacks which are thwarted every day, with terrorist organizations being dismantled every day, including in France yesterday, show that there is an urgent need for action. I take Monika HOHLMEIER's point. We've already made quite a number of proposals before these events. There are, nonetheless, various measures we can adopt immediately without needing any new instruments. And Mr. Kirkhope reminded us of these: making full use of SIS, exchanging information within Interpol, more systematic checks on the external borders of the Union, and also speeding up the adoption of the European PNR. That will be far more effective than having 28 national PNRs. I agree also with Guy Verhofstadt that we need to act fast. We really are at war against barbaric criminals and terrorists. And so, Commissioner, I'm listening to what you've said, but you've never ever given us a time frame. There's urgency today. It's an urgent need to make sure that European citizens are safe. So when are you going to take action? When are you going to implement those measures that don't require any further legislative instruments?
La parola onorevole Sippel.
Ms. Zippel has the floor.
Thank you. Yesterday, the Commission said that in the wake of the Paris attacks, we need action, not measures for the sake of it. Terrorists seek to sow the seeds of fear so that we restrict democracy and freedom. This is a path we should not take, particularly in the wake of the Paris attacks. We need to look at measures, but should we monitor the internet, collect PNR data, tighten up Schengen control measures, new data retention, so on and so forth? Let me remind the Commissioner that the ECJ issued a ruling on eliminating the data retention directive and called for a check on all surveillance measures. We need to look at the criteria adopted by the ECJ. When this comes to PNR, what that means is that we don't just look at access checks and the data retention period. We also consider whether there is a genuine need, a genuine suspicion. Do we have any problem gaining access to data? Well, in the case of the Paris attacks and others, the perpetrators were known to national authorities. National authorities do not use existing measures to the full extent, and exchange of information is clearly insufficient. We need a comprehensive assessment of existing measures before we adopt yet more measures or suggest that more measures be adopted. We need to tackle the root causes of terrorism in our midst, look at discrimination and sidelining marginalisation of young people. To sum up, we should not dismantle civil rights. Now is the time to defend rule of law, freedom, security. That is what we owe our citizens.
Onorevole Karski.
Mr. Karski, please.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Komisarzu. Według...
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, according to an American focus group dealing with counter-terrorism, they've looked at the January terrorist attacks, and apparently there are lots of Chechens behind this. Indeed, in France, Chechens have been arrested with various substances that could be used to make explosives. You also have Russians involved who are linked to Chechnya or Dagestan and who are suspected of having carried out attacks. In Belgium, 2 people were killed and a 3rd Chechen was arrested. If these people are inspiring terrorist attacks, what is Moscow doing? And how is Moscow acting to try and deal with what's going on now?
Honorable Intveld.
Ms. Intveld.
Thank you, Chair. Many people in Europe are afraid, understandably, because the images of Paris, but also other images that we see every day, are scary and intimidating. But our response to their fear should not be just symbolism or fake security. We should do what it takes and not just play for the gallery. First of all, we already have an extensive toolkit. We have the tools, but we need to evaluate if we have all the tools that we need, or if we have the right tools, if we need smaller tools or bigger tools, or maybe if some tools are superfluous. We also need to assess if all those measures that are being decided by the Parliament, but also by the government leaders when they meet in Brussels, if they are then subsequently implemented in the Member States, because they make a lot of grand statements, but I would like to know what is the state of the implementation of the measures. I think we should have a scoreboard like in the internal market. On specific topics, PNR. My group, as we have signalled 2 weeks ago by letter, we are open to discussion on an EU PNR, but there are 2 simple and clear conditions. One is, whatever proposal we will discuss, it must meet the test of necessity and proportionality. That is a legal requirement, not a political requirement. Secondly, the Council needs to adopt the directive on data protection. It's been on their table for 1.5 years. It's not that difficult. Parliament has voted. It will take them 30 seconds to pass it. Now, on encryption, I hear a lot of scary and worrying proposals on a ban on encryption or the obligation to hand over encryption keys. They are dangerous proposals. I mean, what's next? Will it become a criminal offence if you have a lock on your front door of your house? Because that too would be very useful for the fight against terrorism. We are on a slippery slope. And finally, I'm glad to see that we are all united in our determination to fight people who want to destroy our democracy with violent means. But I would want the Council and the Commission to be equally determined when it's about defending democracy, the rule of law and fundamental rights against threat from the inside. And I call on the Commission to put forward proposals, as my group has asked many times, for binding instruments for ensuring and enforcing fundamental rights and the rule of law. Binding instruments, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you.
Onorevole Spinelli.
Ms. Spinelli has the floor. Thank you, President. I want to express my concern regarding the anti-terrorist measures that the Commission and the Council are discussing. and the risk of emergency legislation which would actually oppose the state of law. Member states have already set up internet monitoring. There have been restrictions on free movement within the Schengen zone. Passenger data on the PNR is being retained for unnecessarily long. That's been proposed. Parliament has voted against that. All these things were tried before the attacks in Paris, but didn't stop them. In many places, people are talking about terrorism and the Islamic community in one breath. Ever since the Twin Towers attack, people have been talking in terms of a war against terrorism, but this is not a war. Thank you.
Honorable Joly.
Ms. Joly.
President, Commissioner, colleagues. 3 words: sincerity, lucidity, proportionality. Sincerity, first of all. Don't play on the fears of our citizens. Stop lying. No to a European PNR. It would not have prevented the attacks. We need resources, not fresh legislation. Lucidity, clarity. Analyse where things are breaking down before new measures are proposed. Finally, proportionality. As the Court of Justice reminded us, we need to strike the balance between the fight against terrorism and respect for fundamental rights. Only suspects and those close to them should be subject to surveillance. Wide-scale generalised surveillance will not prevent terrorist attacks. They will, however, undermine fragile democracies. Let's not fight terrorists with methods that would be banned under law. We will buy into terrorist logics in that way. They kill people. Let's not allow them to slay our values.
Onorevole Ferrara.
Ms. Ferrara. Thank you, President. The terrorist threat seen in the Paris events should not be dealt with in the same way as we responded to 9/11, when measures were adopted that have severely restricted fundamental freedoms. Protecting public security could not be done at the risk of psychological terrorism, creating a spirit of insecurity and undermining our rights. We need to use our rights as our source of strength. In the political sphere, anti-terrorism policies have to be based on stepping up intercultural dialogue and social integration. In the immediate future, we need to tackle the threat of radicalization on the internet and the ease with which people are able to buy illegal arms. Any type of funding of terrorist networks must be undermined so that we can really pull them apart.
Alla parola l'onorevole
Marine Le Pen has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, all your decisions have contributed to disarming us, including morally, vis-à-vis these Islamists, in fact over the course of a number of years now. Well, there's one topic that I think hasn't been mentioned at all. Italian journalists have talked about a very worrying issue where they've underestimated the possibility of terrorists coming through Lampedusa and Malta and coming into onto our territory by doing this. Just by claiming that they're a refugee, given the legislation that exists, forces us to welcome these people and indeed forces our people to suffer, and about these people we know absolutely nothing. We have no information whatsoever on these people. We've even had to take Syrian information as holding sway. So we've been put under pressure of terrorism, which seems to have affected our common sense. We're really disarming ourselves by doing this, and we have no way of defending ourselves against these risks apart from reintroducing national borders.
Metsola.
Ms. Metsola.
Thank you. We are so very much shocked by what happened 24 years ago in the Cornelia Hotel in Libya. We witnessed another terrorist attack with more lives lost and so many innocent victims. We have a situation that is growing, and we must face it. Coming from Malta, I know the grave effect of what is happening so close to my home. This attack in Libya followed those attacks in France, and which are more than just horrific attacks on individual people. They were attacks on our values and freedoms that we have built Europe upon. We therefore have challenges of security which are unprecedented. We need to ensure that we are one step ahead of criminals and terrorists. At the same time, we must respect the European values which we cherish. These values must never be lessened in front of these terrorists and these threats. But we must not close our frontiers, as some have said. We become police states. What we must do is to assure that we have a modern legislation which will be able to respond to new threats. At the same time, we need to ensure that such incidents do not fuel racism and xenophobia. One of the concrete measures that we need to work hard upon, and colleagues have touched upon this, is the passenger name record system within the EU. Instead of having fragmented arrangements in various countries, we would have one system, and therefore intelligence sharing will be better and quicker. Therefore, with good oversight mechanisms, this could be a valuable tool so that our citizens will be safer. Now is the time to conclude. Thank you.
Honorable Guillaume.
Ms. Guillaume. Commissioner, colleagues, for some days now, debate has moved forward on certain points, namely the search for balance in the fight against terrorism between upholding the security of the Union and its citizens while protecting their fundamental rights and freedoms. I think we've also made progress on the idea that the fight against terrorism is far more than just a technical issue to be seen purely in security terms. Radicalization has a lot of facets to it, and it's developing both within the European Union and beyond our borders. The European response therefore has to involve an across-the-board, long-term approach with a wide range of players involved. I would therefore like to give my backing to some of the ideas that have already been adumbrated. For example, exchanges of training amongst the European member states, working together with Europol, improving the Schengen information system, cracking down on the legal arms market, and fighting internet networks. The cultural element of the fight against terrorism shouldn't just be a matter of fine words. We have to have some palpable action on the ground. Radicalization often results from people's lack of perspectives and a sense of being lost. We mustn't act out of emotion. No one is defending the status quo, but we have to weigh up the existing European instruments and how they can be used carefully before going any further.
Honorable von Storch.
Ms. von Storch.
President, colleagues, we are here to talk about the fight against terrorism, and there is a question we need to answer. How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice to gain greater safety and security? Can we guarantee that by undermining some freedoms we will guarantee security? A free society will be more vulnerable. Perhaps a totalitarian society would be completely safe. But what about a free society? Now, we've already introduced some measures: biometric passports, CCTV, restrictions on cash payments, ban on encrypted communications. Citizens are well informed. And if I had to decide between freedom and security, I would opt for freedom.
Honorable Wikström.
Ms. Wikström.
Thank you very much, President. Since the attacks in Paris about 3 weeks ago, we once again find ourselves in a situation of mourning. And that's really called us together to try and guarantee safety and security for citizens and to maintain our open society characterized by a respect for fundamental freedoms and people's private lives. Terrorists know no national borders. We know that. That's why it is due time for us, through the EU's agencies, understand that and act just as effectively or even more effectively than these criminal networks are doing. Because we know that the biggest problem is the exchange of information between member states, that is what we need to look at in more focus. We need to create a complete intelligence service. We need to strengthen cooperation between our legal agencies on threats to people, criminal networks, plans for terrible attacks. This is something that we owe to our citizens, and nothing other than that will be agreed. Both safety and openness at the same time.
Ms. Sargentini has the floor. Thank you, President. Of course, we're concerned that European jihadis in Iraq and Syria are fighting together with IS. Let's not forget Jihadi John is their execution. He's from Britain. I'm also worried about attacks in Europe, but we also need to be extremely concerned about what Jihadi John and his friends are doing in Syria and Iraq. And I can't understand why, if we're rejecting that and thinking about what we should be doing here, all our European government leaders didn't waste a minute before going off to Saudi Arabia to pay the respects to the late king. Saudi Arabia is the country that's helped finance terrorism and has just as barbaric practices as IS. It's quite happy to have people whipped and have their hands amputated. That's something we need to reflect on in our anti-terrorism struggle, President.
Honorable Winkberg.
Mr. Winberg.
Talman.
Thank you very much, President. Well, some people are maintaining that terrorism and radicalization is dependent on poverty and the lack of possibilities for young people to have opportunities. Well, in that case, then Greece, with its youth unemployment of over 50%, should be teeming with Boko Haram supporters and terrorists. But we haven't seen a single suicide bomber in Athens and no terrorist attacks for a long time. What does Greece have instead? Well, it has a low level of immigration, it has a joint and common national identity and an understanding of expressing its political will through going to the electoral urns. Study upon study has shown that foreign terrorists in general terms are higher educated and have a higher income than the average from the countries they come from. We saw terrorists in Paris that are anti-Semites. What do all these people have in common? A hate of their home countries and an extreme interpretation of their confession of the faith of Islam. Labour market programs, exit programs and other measures need to be taken, but in the longer term we have to realise that there are many people who have the ability to damage us, both inside the EU and outside the EU, quite simply because they don't have the same view of the world than we do, because their whole soul wants to strive for Sharia law in the Islamic Caliphate.
Honorable Dodds.
Mrs. Dodds, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Firstly, allow me to express my personal sympathy and those of my constituents in Northern Ireland at the recent abhorrent attacks and loss of life. Today we stand with communities in France, in northern Nigeria, and indeed those from the Jewish community experiencing the awful rise of anti-Semitism. Mr. President, as a member of this Parliament from Northern Ireland, I know all too well how the threat and outworkings of terrorism can have devastating consequences, not only for the victims and their families, but also for a nation's consciousness.
In Northern Ireland, we are privileged to have committed police and armed forces. And today, as we assess anti-terrorism measures across Europe, Member States must ensure that their forces are given all the necessary resources to succeed in this fight against terror. The Charlie Hebdo rallies in Paris and across France show a resilience of character that the bulletin bomb will not prevail. Such resilience of character was also evident in my community as the IRA waged a campaign of terror. We held similar rallies after the Enniskillen bomb, after the Omagh bomb and other atrocities. And while the IRA were defeated, sadly for many, justice still evades them, those scarred with terrorist activities. Today's debate is about stopping terrorism, but every day we in this House must focus on the rights and needs of victims of terrorism.
Onorevole Díaz de Mera.
Mr. Díaz de Mera has the floor. Thank you, President. I'd like to start by quoting al-Baghdadi. Any Muslim who's able to shed a drop of the Crusaders' blood should do so. Look what a simple Muslim did in Canada, and our brothers in France and Belgium. May Allah have mercy on them all. What is to come will be worse and more bitter. That is the threat. It's an undoubted, ongoing, current threat, which they are fulfilling. Now, how are we to respond to this threat? Are we up to it here? I wonder. The response has to come from prevention, detection, and repression. We need the whole range of actions that have been mentioned here. Yesterday, I came up with a dictionary of measures and objectives and freedoms, but also in the repression and investigation and judging of those involved. We have to improve our relations with Turkey and Canada and Australia, as well as the United States. We need to strengthen our external borders. We neutralize the arms trade. We can do this with the strength of reason. It's our right and duty to defend our fellow citizens. And we also have a primary right to use the laws available to us. We are stronger but more vulnerable. Either we react fast, or very soon now we'll be having more sterile debates preceded by minutes of silence and more demonstrations expressing solidarity with more victims.
Mr.
Leichtfried.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, in your presentation you said that security would guarantee a democratic society. That is true, and terrorists lay siege to that security and safety, but they also attack other fundamental freedoms of a democratic society: freedom, rule of law. All measures to be taken must be assessed in light of that balance between security and freedoms. If you believe we need more data, well, are we sure that it is necessary now? If you believe we need more data and we need PNR agreements, PNR directives, if that is your belief, then you need to table a proposal reflecting the ECJ ruling and fundamental freedoms. We can talk about it then, but I'm still not convinced that this is necessary. The recent attacks were not due to a lack of information or intelligence, but there weren't enough police officers on the streets. Perhaps that's something we need to discuss: lack of resources. For 15-20 years we have implemented savings cuts and decimated our police forces. They do not have the wherewithal to react. That is something we need to talk. We need to give them more resources rather than organise surveillance of innocent people. Ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed carefully, cautiously. The S&D group is in favour of sensible, rational action to fight terrorism, but not measures for the sake of taking measures that would restrict our freedoms and undermine the rule of law. Those colleagues calling for border checks, let them bear in mind that border checks would not have prevented these attacks. That border checks, though, may have prevented the man from travelling to Paris. It actually saved 6 people in one attack.
Ms. Stevens has the floor.
Beste voorzitter.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, in southern Europe, there's only very marginal security checks that are carried out, in the best cases, checking migrants' papers, but people without papers are allowed in. So there are all sorts of risks here, and here I'm thinking of returning fighters, and this is why it is necessary to have a more frequent, more targeted but not systematic checks to be implemented on the external borders of the EU. I get the impression that the external border with Turkey in effect is far too porous. To deal with this, a first step must be the development of common risk indicators. I think this should enjoy the highest priority, and it's not being dealt with sufficiently to date. Thank you.
Onorevole Fontana.
Mr. Fontana. Thank you, President. To tell you the truth, I've not heard enough from Mr. Commissioner. I'd have liked to hear a bit more self-criticism, because what's happened is, to some extent, also the fault of the European institutions. Look at what Europe has done in recent years on Libya or Iraq, or recently in Syria. Look at what we failed to do in our dealings with countries such as Saudi Arabia, as if that were one of the most tolerant countries in the world. This is a fault of judgment. Just allowing everyone to come to Europe and do whatever they like. If they think they can practice Sharia here, they should just be expelled. Basically, there's a failure of immigration policy. I read yesterday that ISIS is saying it wants to infiltrate terrorists into Libya and get into Europe via the illegal migration circuits. We need stronger borders, and illegal immigrants have to be repatriated.
Onorevole Boni.
Mr. Boni.
Security, which means that needs stronger counter-terrorism actions and the new policy. At the political stage, it is important to avoid losing time, so the idea of pact for counter-terrorism among key political groups in the Parliament is very expected. I want to emphasize some points. 1. We should start common work with the Commission on the renewal of the European internal security strategy. We need clear pillars of this strategy, holistic approach and fast track. 2. It is important to start again work on PNR as a common for 28 member states, full of precise relations to personal data protection, responding to the problem of retention indicated by the Court based on real evidence how this solution could be effective and ensure processing those data which are really needed. 3. We need fast work on the NIS directive. It is important for strengthening cooperation among member states. The key point is to have useful cooperation among all institutions which can contribute in the area of anti-terrorism actions, also responsible for security of our external borders. 4. We need proper legislation adjusted to the terrorism challenges, but on the other hand protecting cultural, ethnic, religious views differentiation, also with respect to the privacy and encryptions by default in devices. It is the key goal to finalize the work on the whole privacy package. 5. Last, we need a good balance between freedom and security. Freedom and security are the two sides of the same face of the European citizen. Thank you.
Onorevole Moraes.
Mr. Moraes, please.
President, in fact, like the Commissioner, I will be going to Riga at 5 o'clock to have the honour of representing the Parliament in the negotiations, and some would think this would be a very difficult task, listening to some of the contrasting views. In fact, I would suggest that this is not as difficult as colleagues would think. My President and other colleagues have actually said that if, notwithstanding the views of Mr Albrecht, if they think that PNR is something that can be justified by the Commissioner, if they believe that PNR is not objectionable in principle, then if we look at proportionality and necessity and we have the safeguards, then that is something, as Mrs Hohlmeier said, if there is actual solidarity, and my colleague Mrs Sippel talked about civil liberties, then together we can achieve this. But I would say to the Commissioner, on behalf of the Parliament, on behalf of my own group, that we have to build trust. And the way that we do this is to say that PNR is not the only component of this strategy and roadmap against anti-terrorism, that it is about radicalisation, it is about Europol getting all of these leads against terrorism, as he said, because fighting terrorism is about the causes. Fighting terrorism is about a whole range of things, as many speakers have said today. Because if it is not about this, then we cannot unify in this Parliament against terrorism, which is such a complex issue, and we should not fool our public and citizens that it is. So we should unify, but not fool our public that this is not a complex issue. We should work together with the Commission and Council in a sophisticated and compassionate way to achieve our objectives with civil liberties and that component taken seriously in these Council meetings. And I hope my colleagues will help us and help with the Council and Commission in these discussions. Thank you.
Onorevole Vistisen.
Ms. Vistisen has the floor.
Når man både hører den debat, der
The debate in the Commission and our debate here today, if you look at both debates, one might conclude that we are ignoring the reasonable measures that member state governments would like to take and that most citizens would like to see implemented. We are defending a number of principles that strike one as good. Let's not record too much data and so on and so forth, but I do believe that the approach is being a little bit fundamentalist. We need to draw on experience in the policies we implement against terrorism. Governments should continue to take the measures necessary to protect European citizens. We should not champion, though, a PNR just for the sake of it.
Mr. Vilimsky.
Ladies and gentlemen, whenever we see the terrorist threat rolling over our continent or attacks as we've just seen, we see the same reactions again and again. You call for undermining fundamental freedoms and rights. You call for more implementation of surveillance technologies. How many more telephones do you want to bug? How much more internet exchange of data do you want to monitor? How much data do you want to suck up? You have to summon up the courage to say that the danger is coming from one certain quarter, and that is Islam. And then you have to look at the reaction that needs to be levelled at that immigration from Islamic countries has to be prohibited, because this is bringing with it, like a Trojan horse, threats. When it comes to asylum, you have to say that asylum has to be granted to those people on the continent where they come from, as the German Internal Minister Thomas de Maizière asked for. Once they come to our continent, they have to understand that this is our continent that is based on Christian and Western values, and they have their problems. If they have a problem with that, then they can go back to their own continent. I demand a zero-tolerance policy to any political extremism, to religious fundamentalism, and I demand that you finally come to terms with this problem in a courageous fashion and and take the right answers rather than beating around the bush.
Onorevole Gardini.
Ms. Gardini. Thank you, President. In the light of what was said by the Commissioner, to the effect that all these statements that are not followed by deeds will increase the lack of confidence amongst our citizens, it's actually difficult to take the floor on this issue. Many eyes will be focused on the meeting in Riga and the informal meeting of the European Council. I think we need something tangible. I won't reiterate the many points made by colleagues. I appreciate what Ms. HOHLMEIER said. What we all need, I think, is to leave our ideology at home. Let's stop being either alarmist or playing things down. Let's listen to our citizens who at the moment are being flooded with information, discordant information with lots of contradictions, and that increases a sense of alarm. We heard the Minister of the Internal Affairs saying at home yesterday there's a risk of terrorists infiltrating by immigration networks, and then we heard what Marine Le Pen said about Libya. Well, we know that Libya is a territory where desperate people are fleeing, but ISIS is stepping up its presence there. People in Italy feel that they're in the front trench, while we're still talking and talking, indulging in ideologically based measures, without actually speeding up the palpable measures that we need. There's this lack of trust amongst the various governments and security forces. We need to overcome rivalries which are actually imposing blocks on the system that we had there. We need to be breathing life into it and using its strength, because security is one of our citizens' greatest rights. This is one of the main reasons states exist. So I'm looking to you, Commissioner, to do something tangible and put what you're pitching into practice. Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, I wonder what scale of atrocity it will take before all members of this Parliament understand that strong security measures exercised with proper oversight by our democratically elected governments, possibly assisted in limited areas by the European Union, are necessary to combat a serious terrorist threat. I must say I'm astonished by some of the views that have been expressed today. In relation to the terrible terrorist attacks in Paris, one of our colleagues remarked, but the perpetrators were known. So what would he have done? I suspect he would be the last person that would see the logical conclusion from what he's just said, and that is that all these suspects should be locked up. That would be the conclusion from what he has just said. And in these times of heightened terrorist threat, our intelligence and security services need the ability to penetrate the black hole that parts of the internet have become, and to identify the patterns of behaviour that might enable terrorists to be identified. We need PNR, but it is just one of many measures that need to be taken. And let us also avoid, by the way, exploiting yet another crisis in order just to give the EU more powers and competence. It's about being effective in our member states.
Onorevole de GRAAFF.
Mr. de GRAAFF.
West-Europa gaat
Western Europe is under the yoke of terrorism, murder and rape. Jihadists and arms traffickers are freely circulating in Europe, while there are madrasas turning people against the West, turning against our values, turning against you and me. Our citizens have had enough. They go onto the streets in Dresden, in Paris, in Milan. What's the European Commission doing? They're calling for more immigration from backward cultures, more from Turkey. Now, enough is enough. Schengen has to be stopped, immigration has to be stopped, Islamization has to be stopped. Get rid of the jihadists. Let's get rid of the terrorists. I demand that the Commission stops immigration immediately and reintroduces internal borders.
Onorevole Voss.
Mr. Voss.
Europe needs a new anti-terrorism strategy and an improved internal security strategy. As things stand, we cannot reassure citizens as to their protection against threats. Commissioner, you're on the right track. We need to demonstrate to citizens and the relatives of victims that we are up to the task at hand. Otherwise, we will have lost out from the very outset. I am quite annoyed to hear some people in this debate refuse to recognise facts. Our freedoms are sufficient for the terrorists to try to attack us. You can talk about data issues, but that is not going to reassure anyone. We need to strike a balance between security and freedom. We also need political will to get that balance right. Perhaps we also need to recognise the fact that experts have been saying for years that findings and intelligence can be extracted from PNR data, intelligence that is not available elsewhere. Efforts have been made in the Commission. Perhaps we should meet them halfway and recognise political needs here, our political responsibilities. People talk about not taking action for the sake of it. Well, let's stop beating about the bush. Let us improve coordination. That is important. It was in the NSA report adopted in March last year. We talked about coordinating between intelligence services. That was rejected at the time. Perhaps we could make progress on that now. Thank you.
Honorable Annemans.
Mr. Annemans has the floor. Colleagues, as a Fleming, and as therefore provisionally a subject of the Kingdom of Belgium, I'd like to offer my apologies to all the victims of Islamic terrorism. Belgium today has specifically been shown on a YouTube clip being threatened with car bombs and beheadings. Belgium is being dubbed France's little sister. Koulibaly and the Kouachi brothers bought their arms 3 kilometres away from here, near the South Station. Terrorist cells have been found on Belgian territory in recent days, and there's a link between terrorism and the way immigration has run its course here in Belgium. Immigration policy under socialist parties for decades in Europe have provided a political time bomb. The borders have been thrown open. Belgium has let people in without any conditions and without paying proper attention to what's going on. They've created a monster over the years, and I would like to apologise to all the victims of terrorism as a result. Ms. Jiménez Becerril, Mario.
Onorevole, se lo richiama, la prego.
Could you please show some respect for the Chamber? Kindly cite the article, the rules of procedure to which you're referring.
Allora, regolamento, l'articolo 186.
Rule 186. A point of procedure. Ms. Mogherini isn't here. And therefore, this very important item, we're fighting Islamic terrorism. That's why I've put on a soldier's costume. This is something we should be doing in Strasbourg and have a full-scale debate for a whole day on this. So, on a point of procedure, I think we should debate this in the presence of Ms. Mogherini, President. That's what I'm requesting. On such important matters as this, that no one else can speak on Ms. Mogherini's behalf. President, I understand your point. This is the kind of issue raised by the groups at the meeting of the Bureau.
sono queste.
These are the serious matters that need to be debated, President. The Speaker's mic has been cut off.
Passiamo al Catch the Eye.
We'll now go on to Catch the Eye.
Onorevole Jimenez, mi scusi.
Oh, I do beg your pardon. I was about to give the floor to Jimenez Becerril.
Señoría. Ladies and gentlemen, the day before yesterday we marked the anniversary of the assassination of my brother and his wife by ETA. 3 weeks ago, terrorists sowed the seeds of terrorism in Paris and spread fear in Europe. My brother was killed by nationalist fanatics. The journalists in Paris were killed by religious fanatics. Today I am speaking not just as a victim of terrorism, but as a citizen of Europe. I would defend the rights of all to live without fear. We need a coherent, consistent, steady policy to fight against terrorism. We should not draw on emotions alone, but we should not sink into indifference. Yes, I am in favour of PNR. We need it. It is urgently required. We need to shoulder responsibility, protect our citizens and fight against terrorists. Terrorists don't care whether we believe in right-wing, left-wing policies, green politics, GUI and so on and so forth. We need to stand united to fight and defend the most important right of all, the right to life. If we do not enjoy the right to life, we cannot enjoy any other freedoms. Please let us bear in mind all victims of terrorism. Thank you.
Passiamo ora.
Thank you. We will now take a round of Catch the Eye. I've had many requests. That's why I didn't allow the use of blue cards. I thought it was better to allow the largest possible number of members of the House to take the floor. Ms. Mussolini has the floor. Thank you, President. Claude MORAES has clear ideas. I was optimistic originally when I heard of these attempts to find a union amongst ourselves, amongst our political forces in Europe, because terrorism derives its nourishment from our divisions. So some think we need to close the borders, reopen the borders, but those are trying to create a feudal state in Europe. Now, 3 people are being called lone wolves. They carried out all these events. Well, despite all our differences, let's agree on the measures we need. A European PNR, well, some want it, others are not so keen, others are completely opposed to it. They don't want passenger name registers exchanged around Europe and don't even want to keep passenger data. But it's important for us to speak out with a single voice if we're to win this difficult fight. I've heard people talking about tolerance. Well, that's all well and good, but what about reciprocity? The Islamists also want mosques to be built, but they are destroying our churches. We need mutual respect.
Gomez.
Ms. Gomes.
Keep talking about foreign fighters and not recognize that the main threat is indeed on ground, coming from EU nationals, as those who attacked in Madrid, in London, in Brussels and lately in Paris. Why do member states, instead of waving PNR as a magic bullet, do not finance adequately information and security service nationally and at the EU level, namely Europol, Eurojust, Frontex, to capacitate them with expertise in Arabic and other language skills, as in human intelligence, to monitor social media, to draw
shared lists of suspects of terrorism, spend resources in targeted instead of mass surveillance, in protecting critical infrastructure, and effectively in fighting cybercrime and financing of terrorism. Why do member states and the EU tolerate proliferation of competing services and crisis centres, even in the EU, at the EU level as well as national level, competing with each other instead of cooperating and sharing information? Why did they not invest into a single crisis and information centre at the EU level to serve all EU institutions and articulate with member states? And of course, why have they, instead of austerity that fosters social disintegration, why do they not finance programs to prevent radicalisation and de-radicalise the young people from our communities that are being drawn into these horrendous activities?
Vi prego di rispettare.
Please do respect the speaking time allowed to catch the eye. The more colleagues respect the speaking time, the more we'll be able to speak.
Panie Przewodniczący, Szanowni Państwo.
Thank you very much, President, ladies and gentlemen. Given a phenomenon like terrorism, we have to stand shoulder to shoulder and we have to react quickly. Mrs. HOHLMEIER asked us to act together, but listening to some of the voices from the left side of this chamber and the Greens, she was shouted down, and they're saying we don't want any new instruments against terrorism, and the Socialists are saying something along these soft-pedalled lines as well, Mr. Verhofstadt too. But what's more worrying is the very slow tempo from the Commissioner. He said that it's only in May that we're going to start a program for counter-terrorism. It's only then that we'll have an agenda that we'll be able to work according to. That seems to be a very slow tempo indeed. We can't talk about having an effective fight against terror and talk about protecting fundamental freedoms. I'd like to see specific instruments. And Commissioner, I'd like to see the tempo picked up a bit. Thank you.
Ms. Bilbao Barandica. Thank you, President. Security to protect European society has to be in line with our democratic standards. The first tool we have is intelligence. We need to coordinate our objectives, ensure that information is exchanged at European level, and make efficient use of all the technical and human resources available to us. And the most intelligent thing is to pool the strength of what we have. But the worst thing we can possibly do is reduce our freedoms and indulge in the kind of linkage that leads to people being scapegoated. We have to overcome the social gap, which is a great breeding ground for terrorism. Ms. Zuber. Preventing and fighting terrorism can no longer be a pretext for imposing a security agenda which cut down freedoms and rights for our citizens, such as we saw with the Patriot Act. We need judicial cooperation measures, but the democratic rights acquired by the citizens of the individual countries are being undermined. We need serious measures to fight the funding of terrorism via offshore arrangements, and we need to fight the arms trade. Terrorism is terrorism wherever it may be. The European Union and other forces should not be providing funding for groups linked to Al-Qaeda and IS, and then suddenly turn against when they get too close to home. What about what's going on in the occupied territories of Palestine and drones being used to hit innocent civilian populations? That's terrorism, wherever it may be.
Onorevole Corrao.
Mr. Corrao. Thank you, President. Commissioner Avramopoulos, colleagues. We have security on the one hand, this demand for security. On the other hand, there are civil rights and freedoms. When you weigh these two up, the risk is that in the name of the risk of terrorism, the civil rights we've built up with such difficulties over the years will be overwhelmed. We have to be careful that significant freedoms are not undermined. Mr. Albrecht is right to say that there are tools already available that should be put to better use. For example, on security, there's not enough cooperation amongst the intelligence services of the individual member states. So let's ensure that the information is exchanged more effectively. Otherwise, we may actually be moving backwards. I don't understand Ms. Le Pen's point about building up the borders, returning to a colonialist policy of 100 years ago. The world has moved on from that. You can't call Schengen into question. Thank you.
Morvai.
Ms. Morvai.
Köszönöm szépen. Mindenki, akinek van szíve, meg...
Thank you. I believe that anyone with a heart is shocked by the tragic loss of life through terrorism. But if you also have a brain, you will see how easy it is to whip up the fear that people have of terrorists and use that fear to introduce measures to undermine freedoms and rights. What we end up with is a system that lacks transparency, forces citizens to be subject to checks and surveillance. Let us not forget that in the fight against terrorism, the West has introduced complete surveillance of the internet. Let us not forget torture in Guantanamo Bay. The West has also waged 2 unjust wars. Many have lost their lives, primarily civilians. These are events that have not helped.
I can't allow speakers to take more than a minute. I will have to be strict so that the Commission will have time to field all the questions. Now, Mr. Chauveau.
Thank you, Chair. The global nature of recent terrorist violence demands to double our efforts to provide a genuine area of security and that we integrate the internal and external aspects of the fight against terrorism. Many of the instruments we had already put in place. In such cases, we need only to consolidate or better apply rules or to exercise trust among member states. A European security policy would probably have more respect for the rule of law and fundamental rights principles than the current patchwork of individual member state solutions. Fighting for more security should never jeopardize the other objectives of freedom and justice. This is what we must always differentiate us from the people we try to protect ourselves from. However, all security policy measures must go hand in hand with a parallel introspection regarding the causes of radicalisation and an effort to developing more social cohesion and inclusiveness in our societies. Thanks.
Honorable López Aguilar.
López Aguilar.
Quiero unirme a quienes en este debate.
Chairman, I'd like to echo those who, during the course of the debate, have reminded us that Islam is not the enemy. Rather, it's criminal extremism on the part of those who are willing to kill and die. The bloodiest terrorist attack in recent years was not carried out by an Islam. It was Anders Breivik, a far-right racist, full of hatred against Islam and multiculturalism. The battle to establish the proper balance between security and freedom cannot be at the cost of the European Union's DNA. We have to fight for our values against social exclusion and marginalism, which is where psychotic terrorism can grow. I'd like to remind you too of the importance of legislating against hate speech. In the Spanish Constitution, we managed to have defence of terrorism made an offence.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, Islamic radicalism and fanaticism is a big challenge to Western civilization, maybe the greatest one. This religion is viewed as a politics, as a way of delivering politics, and the only aim there is to conquer the whole world. We have two choices: to resist or to lose this fight. But we cannot just make statements. President, ladies and gentlemen, we need a strong state with borders, with intelligence, with national security. What we should do as the European Parliament is to use our political instruments. And one of those, Mr. Commissioner, is to sanction any country that supports terrorism, like Turkey, a country that uses EU funds, a country that organizes human trafficking, a country that funds ISIS and heals them when they're wounded. This is a country that threatens Greece and Bulgaria, neighboring countries, by transferring illegal immigrants. You should request these sanctions. Thank you.
Per un minuto.
Thank you, President. Well, times are not usual times, and the threats and risks, both interior and exterior in nature, are real and clear and present. Europe has to show its capacity to react within the natural framework of the rule of law. Of course, we have to improve sharing information, reinforce SIS, Europol, implement a European PNR which is smart in nature. Also, we have to have a systematic control of Schengen borders, both in the air and on the ground, to make sure that we can show that Schengen is efficient. Why not set up a European Public Prosecutor's Office as well? And in the longer term, we need to have a real strategy to deal with these networks, which often don't really help, and they become schools for terrorists in our member states. We need to look at the responsibility that Turkey needs to shoulder, and together with them we need to think about a policy of perhaps having temporary visas. We also have to promote a defence system in Europe, and that will show us that we're up to the challenge.
Ultimo caso l'onorevole Salvini.
Thank you, Mr. Salvini. It doesn't appear to be here, so I shall give the floor to the Commissioner.
Grazie, signor Presidente. Honourable members of the Parliament, first of all, allow me to express my thanks to all of you for your contributions to this very interesting and important debate. In the face of the monstrous attacks this month, and in responding to the ongoing threat of terrorist attacks, Europe must remain strong and united in its response. Don't have any doubt that the Commission will do its part to support the response at EU level, and we will work hand in hand with the European Parliament and obviously with Member States in our common goal of keeping Europe open and secure. On EU PNR, since many members of the Parliament refer to that, I want to clarify it once again. Our position remains unchanged. The Commission is committed to work together with the co-legislators to achieve a legal instrument which is both effective and is fully in line with fundamental rights. We are very carefully assessing all options for how the Commission can best help European Union legislators to reach a quick and effective result on the EU PNR proposal. Allow me to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Kirkhope, for the work he is currently doing. We will be next to him. On the implementation of existing measures, indeed, it is a priority for us. The Commission is expecting responses by the 15th of March from all Member States. On Schengen now. Yes, I agree with Mr. Verhofstadt. Schengen is not a problem. It is part of the solution, and I explained in my opening remarks how we need to make the maximum use of the existing possibilities, the best use of this tool. I would like to thank again for this very timely debate. I got one important message out of this, that we should be united, work together, here but also with all institutions. The Commission is committed to work with you to the benefit of all citizens, to defend their rights and their security, to work with you in trust and unity. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. The debate is closed. The vote will be taken tomorrow.
Elle est là, oui. Tout le monde est là. Bonjour, mes chers collègues.
Good afternoon. We will now have Council and Commission statements on the European Fund for Strategic Investments. Ms. Kalina Lukashevich, you have the floor on behalf of the Council.
Madam President, honourable members, thank you for inviting the Council to participate in this very important debate on the EU Fund for Strategic Investments. And this file is a priority for all three institutions, which in itself is a very good starting point for further discussions. I am grateful for this opportunity to share my views on this issue. The European Parliament has been instrumental in bringing the issue of investment to the forefront of the European agenda. Hence, I am particularly pleased to stand here today as we start working on the first concrete deliverable of the investment plan. The EU Fund for Strategic Investments is a top priority for the Latvian Presidency and for the Council. It is essential that we strengthen economic growth and reduce unemployment in the EU. The investment package is designed to deliver on this dual goal, and it is of utmost importance that the co-legislators work closely together and work as quickly as possible. I find it useful to recall that President Juncker and the European Council have set an ambitious deadline, and we really count on the Parliament's support in achieving it. The current investment situation requires resolute and swift action. We want to see the first projects in place already this year. The Council has already started examining the proposals in ad hoc working party with a very high meeting frequency. Already 2 meetings took place last week, and the next one is foreseen for tomorrow. We aim to reach a general approach already by March to allow sufficient time to agree with Parliament well before the summer deadline. The ECOFIN Council will keep a close eye on progress with this proposal, which will feature prominently on our agenda. In fact, the first intensive exchange of views on the proposal at the ministerial level took place yesterday. I am confident that the Parliament is willing to match our ambitions, and I look forward to our constructive cooperation. This is going to test our mutual commitment to boost Europe's economic recovery. Honourable Members, while the importance of the EU Fund for Strategic Investments could not be overestimated, it is only one part of the Commission's investment plan, the so-called liquidity pillar, designed to mobilise finance for investment. The second pillar of the Commission's plan, the project pipeline, and the setting up of the European Investment Advisory Hub is also part of the current legislative proposal. By helping to identify well-structured, reliable and viable projects, we ensure that the private sector participates and that the money is channeled to the real economy. So we must pay due attention to these measures accompanying the setting up of the fund, as they will be key to the successful delivery of strategic projects across Europe. However, it is perhaps the third pillar, improving the investment environment, that will ultimately be the most important to foster private investments. This is a much broader issue that needs to be tackled at many different levels. From an EU perspective, it is a question of completing the single market. A number of measures have already been announced by the Commission, for instance under the banner of the Capital Market Union. The Council stands ready to work together with the European Parliament and the Commission on all initiatives designed to enhance the single market and to improve the competitiveness of the EU. At the same time, action is needed also at national level to remove any barriers to investments and unlock the growth potential